Wyoming Territory. Autumn 1886. Rope on her wrists. The whole barn laughing. $100 for a Barren bride. Then one man stepped forward, laid the money down, looked Crow dead in the eye. I did not buy the woman. I bought the last claim you will ever place on her. Evelyn had never had anyone stand up for her before. Stay with me and find out what real freedom looks like. The barn smelled like wet hay and unwashed men. Rain hammered the freight roof so hard it swallowed half the voices inside. Lanterns swung from the crossbeams, throwing orange light across the crowd. Ranchers, miners, a few drifters pressed shoulder to shoulder, all of them watching the wooden platform at the far end of the room. Evelyn Moore stood on that platform with her wrists tied in front of her. She kept her eyes down. The rope wasn't pulled tight enough to cut, but her hands had gone numb anyway. From cold or from fear, she couldn't tell anymore. Her dress was dirty. The hem was torn where she'd caught it getting out of the freight wagon 2 nights before. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, and the lantern light made the room tilt whenever she stood too still. The man beside her was named Silas Crow. He wore a clean coat and spoke in the smooth, careful voice of someone who had practiced lying so long it no longer felt like lying. "Gentlemen," Crow announced, spreading his hands wide, "what you see before you is an opportunity." Laughter already, before he'd even finished. Evelyn didn't look up. She thought about the advertisement she'd answered 8 weeks ago. Respectable housemaid positions available, Wyoming Territory. Travel arranged, wages guaranteed. She'd read it 3 times in the drafty hall of St. Agnes Orphan Home, checking each word like she could press the truth out of it through sheer effort. The women at the agency had been polite. They'd given her tea. One of them had told her she had kind eyes. She remembered the tea tasting slightly wrong. She didn't remember much after that. "Miss Moore is 23 years of age," Crow continued. "She is in acceptable health. She is an orphan with no family, no property, and no one in any state or territory who will come searching for her." He let that last part settle over the room like smoke. "She arrived under a travel and employment contract, the balance of which remains unpaid. The gentleman who satisfies that debt will have himself a wife." A voice from somewhere near the back. "How much?" $100. The muttering started immediately. Evelyn felt it more than heard it, the way a room shifts when people are calculating. Then Crow said the other part, the part he always saved for the crowd, because the crowd enjoyed it. "I should note, in the interest of full disclosure, that Miss Moore was examined by a physician prior to transport. She suffered a severe fever in childhood." He paused. "The doctor found her unlikely to bear children." 1 second of silence. Then a ranch hand, somewhere in the middle of the room, let out a laugh that bent him double. $100 for a Barren bride. The whole barn came apart. Evelyn's jaw tightened. She focused on a knothole in the platform floor. A small, dark circle in the wood, perfectly ordinary, the kind of thing no one had ever looked at on purpose before. She stared at it and breathed through her nose and reminded herself that she had survived 6 weeks in a locked freight wagon, 2 transfers, and a night sleeping on straw in a barn not unlike this one. She could survive laughter. Several men climbed onto the platform's edge to look at her more closely. One reached out and lifted her chin with 2 fingers, turning her face toward the light. She couldn't stop him. She understood by then what happened when she tried to stop them. Crow was watching her with flat, patient eyes. He'd told her in the wagon, quietly, without raising his voice, "If no man pays your debt tonight, you go to the mining camp. There are men there who don't care much about a contract." She believed him. The man, inspecting her face, dropped her chin and stepped back. "Too thin," he said to nobody in particular. 100 steep. Someone else called out. "What else can she do?" "She can cook," Crow said. "She is literate. She is obedient." Evelyn had never been particularly obedient in her life, but she stayed quiet. The side doors opened, letting in a gust of cold air and the smell of rain, and a few heads turned. A man in a worn canvas coat came through. moving toward the far end of the room, where grain sacks were stacked along the wall. He wasn't looking at the platform. He was checking the writing on a feed label, turning it toward the nearest lantern. He was tall, dark hair, wet at the ends from the rain. He looked like someone who had come to buy winter feed and found, to his inconvenience, that there was an auction happening in the same building. Someone from the crowd offered $50 and announced he needed a kitchen servant. Crow shook his head. 100. The debt is fixed. The man in the canvas coat looked up from the feed label. His eyes moved across the room with a kind of attention that didn't seem like curiosity exactly. More like someone doing a quick count, checking for things that didn't add up. Then he saw the tag around Evelyn's neck. It was a small rectangle of stamped metal on a cord. Crow's company issued them to every woman at the first transfer station, and Evelyn had watched another girl try to tear hers off and fail because the cord was woven wire. The man in the canvas coat went very still. He crossed the room without hurrying. People moved for him, not because he pushed, but because something in the way he walked suggested he was going to arrive at his destination, whether or not there were people standing in his path. He stopped at the edge of the platform and looked directly at Crow. "Is this woman being sold as a wife?" he asked, "or as a debtor?" Crow smiled. He had a specific smile for questions like that, warm, businesslike, slightly offended. The lady entered into a marriage and employment contract of her own free will. I'm simply recovering the cost of her travel. The man looked at Evelyn. She made herself look back. His eyes were gray-green and steady, and there was no cruelty in them, which frightened her almost as much as cruelty would have. She had learned to predict cruelty. Steadiness she didn't know what to do with. She wanted to say something. Anything. She wanted to tell him the contract was signed, while she was barely conscious, that she hadn't understood half the words, that the woman at the agency who'd said she had kind eyes was one of Crow's employees. She wanted to tell him about Hannah, the girl who'd run 3 weeks ago, and what Crow's men had done to her at the edge of the road while the wagon sat waiting. Nothing came out. Crow said, "If you're not buying, friend, the feed is along the south wall." The man reached into his coat and placed a folded stack of bills on the table beside Crow. $100, he said. The room went quiet. Then it went loud. Men laughing, men calling out, a few asking who he was. The man stepped up onto the platform. He was close enough now that Evelyn could have touched him. She pressed back half a step instead, and he stopped immediately, like he'd expected that. He reached down and worked the knot loose from her wrists. His hands didn't linger. When the rope fell, he let it fall. He turned back to Crow. "That settles the debt." Crow picked up the bills and counted them with the ease of someone who had done it many times before. "You'll need to sign the marriage contract." No, the woman was sold as a bride. The money covers the debt you claimed she owed. Nothing else. He looked at Crow the way you look at a door you're deciding whether to open. "I'm not signing a contract." Crow's voice stayed smooth. "Then the woman belongs to you." The man glanced at Evelyn once, then back at Crow. "I did not buy the woman," he said. "I bought the last claim you will ever place on her." Someone in the crowd said, "Huh." Someone else laughed, but it was a confused kind of laugh, the sound of a joke nobody quite understood. Crow said nothing. He folded the bills into his coat pocket. The man stepped down from the platform. He didn't take Evelyn's arm. He didn't tell her to follow him. He just moved toward the side door and left space beside him. She looked at Crow. Crow looked back at her with no expression at all, which was its own kind of answer. She stepped off the platform and followed the man toward the door. Outside, the cold hit her like a flat hand, rain and wind and the smell of mud and horses. The man had stopped a few feet from the door. He was unbuttoning his canvas coat, and for one sick moment, Evelyn's whole body went rigid. Then he held the coat out to the side, away from himself, not toward her. Just held it there. She couldn't make herself reach for it. He set it on the edge of the wagon step beside her and moved away, giving her space to take it or leave it. She stood there with rain, running down the back of her neck. She didn't know if this man was rescuing her or transporting her somewhere private to continue what Crow had started. She had no way to know. She had nothing to go on except the fact that he'd stepped back every single time she flinched, which was not something Crow's men had ever done. She picked up the coat. The wagon moved out into the dark and the rain, and Evelyn sat with the coat pulled over her shoulders and watched the road behind them, through the gap in the canvas. A rider was following them. She could see the shape of him through the rain, 50 yards back, keeping pace. She saw the dark line of an arm coming up. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The rider raised a revolver. Caleb lost the rider at the river crossing. He drove the wagon into the shallows at an angle, let the current push the rear wheels sideways, then came out on the far bank heading north instead of west. The rider's lantern bobbed on the other side for a while, moving up and down the bank, looking for tracks that the water had swallowed. Eventually, it stopped moving. Evelyn watched until the light disappeared completely. Then she faced forward and didn't look back again. They reached Mercer Ranch well after dark. No moon, just cold cloud and the sound of wind cutting through the pine ridge to the east. The house sat low against the hill. 2 stories, lamp burning in the front window. Caleb drew the horses up and climbed down first, then walked around to the wagon's side without reaching up to help her. He just stood there, giving her room to get down however she chose. She climbed down herself. Her legs shook when she hit the ground, but she stayed upright. He led her up the porch steps and opened the front door. The warmth inside hit her so suddenly she had to grip the doorframe. A fire in the main room, yellow and steady. A braided rug. A table with a coffee mug still steaming on it. Ordinary things. The kind of room that looked like someone actually lived in it rather than occupied it. Evelyn stepped inside. Caleb closed the door behind her. The sound of the latch dropping that small, final click went through her like cold water. Her back found the nearest wall before she decided to move. She pressed herself into the corner between the door and the window and could not make herself leave it. Caleb turned around and saw her there. He didn't say anything immediately. He didn't move toward her. He set his wet hat on the hook by the door and ran one hand through his damp hair and looked at the fire instead of at her. "Martha," he called. A woman appeared from the hallway, 60s, wide through the shoulders, with the unhurried movement of someone who had seen most things and decided to remain calm about all of them. She looked at Caleb once, then at Evelyn, and her face did that thing faces do when they're working hard, not to show too much at once. "Get the spare room ready," Caleb said quietly, "and something warm to eat." Martha nodded and disappeared back down the hallway without asking a single question. Caleb crossed to the fireplace and crouched to add another log. He kept his back to Evelyn while he did it. She understood, after a moment, that this was on purpose, giving her somewhere to look other than at him. "You're safe here," he said, still facing the fire. "Nobody's going to come in without your say." Evelyn pressed harder into the wall. Martha came back with a bowl of soup and set it on the table, then looked at Evelyn with the particular patience of someone who understood that the soup might not be touched for a while. "I'll help you get settled," Martha said. Not a question, not a command, just an offer left in the air. Evelyn couldn't make herself answer. She was still wearing her torn dress, and Caleb's coat, both of them damp at the hem. Martha moved toward her slowly, the way you'd approach something frightened, stopping a few feet away and waiting. Evelyn flinched when Martha reached for the coat. Martha stopped immediately. "All right," she said, simply. "All right." Caleb stood up from the fire. "I'll be outside," he said. He looked at Evelyn once, direct and brief. Then he walked out the back door and closed it softly behind him. Martha helped Evelyn to the spare room, got her a dry dress and a pitcher of warm water, and stood in the hallway while Evelyn changed, facing away and talking in a low voice about nothing important, the weather, the horses, how hard the winter had come this year. Just sound, just another person being present without requiring anything. Evelyn didn't remove the coat until Martha had her back turned. The dress Martha gave her was plain gray wool and too large in the shoulders. Evelyn rolled the sleeves up and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands, which had finally stopped shaking. Martha showed her the lock on the bedroom door. It was a new lock, the metal still bright, the kind that could only be turned from inside. She placed a small iron key in Evelyn's palm. Evelyn looked at the key for a long moment. She'd lived 23 years, and no one had ever given her a key to anything. "You lock it whenever you want," Martha said, "and nobody will touch that door." After Martha left, Evelyn sat in the room for a long time. The bed was clean, the blanket heavy, the window showing nothing but dark, and the occasional shape of tree branches moving in the wind. She could hear the horses in the nearby stable. She could hear the fire still burning in the main room. She didn't sleep in the bed. She took the blanket off and lay down on the floor beside it, with the pillow under her head and the blanket pulled up to her chin. The floor was solid beneath her. She could feel every plank. It felt less risky than the bed somehow, less like accepting something that could be taken away. Before she closed her eyes, she slid the piece of bread she'd been given with dinner inside the sleeve of her dress, just in case. She fell asleep before she realized she'd done it. The nightmare came sometime before dawn. The freight wagon, the smell of it, the dark, Hannah's voice cutting off mid-sentence. Evelyn woke gasping and didn't know where she was for 3 long seconds. Then someone spoke quietly through the door. "You're at Mercer Ranch." Caleb's voice, low and even. "The door is still locked." "I'm in the hallway. I'm not coming in." She put her hand flat on the floor and breathed. "Take your time," he said. She didn't answer him. She pulled the blanket up around her shoulders and sat with her back against the bed frame and waited for her heart to slow down. She could hear him outside the door, not moving, not pacing, just there. She must have fallen back asleep, because when she opened her eyes, pale morning light was crossing the floor. She unlocked the door and opened it. Caleb was sitting against the hallway wall, with his legs stretched out and his arms crossed, and his chin dropped toward his chest. He'd spent the night there. On the floor, in the hallway outside her locked door. His coat was still on. His boots were still on. He'd left the lamp burning low at the end of the hall so she wouldn't wake to darkness. He heard the door and lifted his head. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Evelyn looked at him sitting on that floor and could not, for the life of her, find a reason for it that made sense. Inside the framework of every other man she'd ever known, he stood up slowly, favoring his left shoulder from where he'd slept against the wall. "Martha's got breakfast," he said. "You don't have to come out if you're not ready." He walked to the far end of the hall and turned the corner and was gone. Evelyn stood in the doorway and looked at the flattened dust on the floor where he'd been sitting. She went and found the breakfast Martha had left on a tray outside her door: biscuits, boiled eggs, a cup of coffee still warm. She picked up the tray and carried it inside and ate every bit of it sitting on the floor with the door locked again and the key still in her hand. That afternoon, Caleb nailed a black mark off the front gate post. He found it while doing his morning check, a carved symbol pressed deep into the wood. The mark Crow's riders used to flag properties. That evening, he found the dead crow. It was nailed to the gate with a piece of rough cord, head hanging, wings flat. A folded paper was tied around neck. He opened it and read it, standing at the gate in the cold wind. "The girl belongs to us. Return her before the first snow." Caleb stood there long enough that his breath clouded and dispersed twice. Then he folded the paper, put it in his coat pocket, and walked back to the house. He had 3 days, maybe 4, before the first snow fell. He spent that night figuring out what to do with them. The snow came on a Tuesday. Evelyn was trying to carry a bucket of water from the pump to the kitchen when her knees quit. No warning, no dizziness she could have caught. One moment she was walking, and the next she was on the ground, the bucket on its side, and water soaking into the snow around her. She woke in bed. Caleb was sitting in the chair across the room, maybe 8 feet away, and she saw him before she fully understood where she was. Her whole body came alert at once. She sat up fast and pressed back against the headboard, and the sound she made wasn't quite a word. Caleb stood immediately. Both hands came up, open, away from his sides. He crossed to the door in 3 steps and went through it without pausing, pulling it shut behind him. She sat there with her heart slamming and stared at the closed door and breathed. A minute passed, maybe 2. She heard Martha's voice in the hallway, quiet and even, and then a knock soft on the doorframe rather than the door itself. "It's Martha, honey. Can I come in?" "Yes," Evelyn said. Her voice came out thin and scraped sounding. Martha came in with the doctor behind her. He was older, with a gray beard, and the manner of someone accustomed to being led into rooms where he wasn't entirely welcome. He stood near the door and asked her permission before he moved closer, which surprised her enough that she nodded before she could think too hard about it. He was thorough but careful. Martha stayed beside her the entire time, her hand resting on the bed rail, not touching Evelyn but there. When he finished, he sat back and looked at her with the professional directness of someone who believed that people deserved to be told the truth about their own bodies. "You're malnourished," he said, "and exhausted down to the bone, not the kind that a few nights of sleep fixes. You've also got an infection in your left hand, likely from a rope abrasion that wasn't cleaned properly." He paused. "And the matter of the fever you had as a child. I assume you were informed at some point that it likely affected your ability to carry a child." "Yes," Evelyn said. He nodded. "That information is accurate." The room was very quiet. Evelyn stared at the blanket across her lap. She waited for what came next, the recalculating, the shift in expression, the conclusion she'd watched men arrive at all her life when presented with that particular fact. The door opened, and Caleb stepped back in. He didn't look at the doctor first. He looked at Evelyn. "She needs several weeks of real rest and proper feeding," the doctor said. "No heavy work, no cold. The hand needs to be cleaned and wrapped daily." Caleb nodded once. Evelyn said, quickly, before she could stop herself, "I know what this means. For what you—" She stopped. Tried again. "If you want me to go somewhere else, I understand." Caleb looked at her steadily. "I didn't rescue you to obtain children," he said. She waited for the second half of that sentence. There was no second half. He just stood there and let the words sit. She couldn't make herself believe him, but she noted that he'd said it. The doctor left. Martha changed the bandage on Evelyn's hand and brought soup and stayed until Evelyn had eaten most of it, then left her to sleep. 3 days passed. Evelyn stayed in her room, coming out only to use the outhouse, locking the bedroom door each time she returned. She watched the snow through the window. She slept more than she expected to. On the 4th morning, she noticed the mare. Caleb had brought an elderly gray horse into the small pasture just outside Evelyn's window. The horse moved slowly, head low, stopping frequently to stand and breathe in the cold air. There was something careful about the animal. It kept its hindquarters toward the fence, kept its eyes on Caleb as he moved around the pasture. Every time Caleb lifted his hands above his waist, the horse shifted sideways. Caleb didn't seem bothered by this. He moved slowly, kept his arms low, and talked while he worked. Evelyn couldn't hear what he was saying through the glass, but she could see his mouth moving in an easy, unhurried way. He never reached for the horse. He would get close, stop, wait, then move on to the next task, mucking out a corner of the pasture, rehanging a gate latch, checking a water trough for ice. The mare watched him the whole time, and Caleb let her watch without trying to change what she thought of him. After an hour, he placed several pieces of apple on the top rail of the fence and walked away to the far end of the pasture. The mare stood in place for a long time. Then she walked slowly to the fence and ate the apple off the rail. Evelyn pressed her forehead against the cold glass and watched. Later, when Martha brought lunch, Evelyn asked who the horse was. "That's Willow," Martha said. "Caleb's had her 3 years. She was a working horse before, but somebody used ropes on her in a way they shouldn't have. She panics if she sees one raised now. Caleb bought her from a man who was going to put her down. Evelyn thought about that. That afternoon, she unlocked her door and went to stand on the back porch, wrapped in her coat, watching Caleb work in the pasture below. He noticed her, but didn't wave or call out. He just went on with what he was doing. After a while, she said, "Loud enough to carry? Why don't you punish her?" "When she moves away from you," Caleb looked up. "Fear is not disobedience," he said. She sat with that for a moment. The wind came off the pine ridge and moved across the snow, and the gray mare stood at her end of the pasture, with her ears tilted toward Caleb's voice. "Does that apply to people too?" Evelyn asked. Caleb rested his arm on the fence rail. "It should," he said. She stayed on the porch another 10 minutes, until the cold got into her fingers. Then she went back inside. That evening, she came to dinner. She moved her chair to the end of the table, closest to the hallway door, and sat down. Martha put food in front of her. Caleb sat at the far end and talked to Martha about the roof on the east barn and didn't ask Evelyn questions. He just left room for her to be there without requiring her to fill it with anything. She ate the whole plate. When she finished, she looked at the apple sitting beside her bowl, the one Martha always included, the one Evelyn had been pocketing every night, and she left it there on the table. It was a small thing. Nobody mentioned it. But she left it there. She was still sitting at the table when the front door opened, and Jonah Briggs, the ranch foreman, stepped in stamping snow off his boots. He had a look on his face that Evelyn had already learned to read the careful blankness of someone who was deciding how much to say in front of her. "Sheriff's coming up the road," Jonah said. "Got 2 deputies with him." He looked at Caleb. "And a paper," he added. "Legal looking." The sheriff's name was Aldous Heck, and he filled the doorframe the way men do when they want you to notice how much of it they fill. 2 deputies behind him, both armed. The paper in his hand had an official seal pressed into the bottom corner. He looked around the main room, spotted Evelyn at the table, and pointed at her with 2 fingers, like she was a piece of property he'd been sent to collect. "That her?" he asked Caleb. "Her name is Evelyn Moore," Caleb said. The sheriff stepped inside without being invited. "Miss Moore, you need to pack whatever belongs to you and come with us. You're being returned to the custody of the Western Brides Employment Company, pending resolution of your contract." Evelyn looked at the badge on the sheriff's coat and went somewhere inside herself. She knew that badge. Not Heck specifically, but the authority behind it, the kind of authority Crow had always used as a wall to stand behind. She'd seen him show papers to men in uniform before and watched them step aside. Her hands flattened against the table. She could not speak. Caleb moved between her and the sheriff without making it look like a blockade. He kept his voice level. On whose authority? Heck held up the document. Silas Crow filed a complaint with the territorial court. He's produced a signed contract showing this woman agreed to 2 years of service if no husband accepted her debt. You took her without signing the marriage papers, which means you removed her without legal standing. I paid her debt in full. You paid a purchase price for a bride you didn't marry. That's not debt settlement. That's theft of contracted goods. The word goods landed in the room like something dropped. Caleb's expression didn't change. "She is not going back, sir. I have a warrant. I understand what you have." Caleb looked at the 2 deputies, then back at Heck. "I'm asking you to look at this woman and tell me you believe she signed a 2-year service contract of her own free will." Heck looked at Evelyn. Whatever he saw there, he looked away quickly. "What I believe doesn't factor into a signed legal document. If she wants to contest the contract, she needs to say so herself. Right now, in front of me." Everyone looked at Evelyn. The 2 deputies, both armed. The sheriff with his warrant. Caleb standing 3 feet in front of her, and she could see the tension in his shoulders even from behind. She opened her mouth. Nothing. Her throat had closed like a fist. She could see Crow's face in her memory, the flat, patient smile, the way he'd spoken to her in the wagon before the auction. "I know a woman who tried to speak against me to a lawman once." She didn't get another opportunity. She pressed her lips together and looked at the table. Heck sighed. You see the problem. Give us a moment, Martha said sharply, from the hallway. She came into the room, holding a folded paper of her own. Before anyone takes anyone anywhere, I want you to look at this. She placed the auction receipt on the table in front of the sheriff. That is a receipt for $100, paid by Caleb Mercer to the Western Bride's Employment Company on the night of the auction, for the full and total settlement of Evelyn Moore's alleged travel debt, signed by Silas Crow's own hand. Heck picked it up and read it. The room was quiet enough that Evelyn could hear the fire. This covers the debt, Heck said, slowly. But not the service contract. There is no service contract, Caleb said. Crow produced a document she signed, while she was barely conscious after being transported across 3 territories against her will. I will take that matter before a federal court. Heck rubbed his jaw. He looked like a man doing arithmetic he didn't enjoy. There's a federal marshal passing through Red Hollow in 3 days. I can arrange for him to hear the matter. He folded the receipt and set it back on the table. But until then, I'm not in a position to. Then we'll be there in 3 days, Caleb said. With the receipt, with Miss Moore's testimony if she chooses to give it, and with whatever else I've been collecting for 7 years regarding Silas Crow's business practices. That last part made Heck go still for just a second. Then he straightened his coat. 3 days, he said. Don't make me come back. The deputies filed out behind him. The door closed. The room exhaled. Evelyn was still staring at the table when Caleb pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He didn't say anything at first. He just folded his hands on the table and waited until she looked up. I should have made sure you weren't in the room when armed men came through that door, he said. That's on me. I'm sorry. She blinked. She'd been bracing for something different. Blame, impatience, the speech about how she needed to speak for herself if she wanted to stay free. She'd been building walls against all of it. She didn't know what to do with an apology. Couldn't she start it? I know, he said. She looked at him. You need me to testify. In front of the marshal. I need you to be safe. Those aren't always the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper she could see. It was covered in handwritten notes, questions with lines underneath, organized and thorough. He unfolded it halfway, looked at it, then folded it back up. I had a sister, he said, Rebecca. She was 19 when she answered an advertisement. Honest work in Wyoming Territory, it said. She left on a Tuesday in spring, and I never saw her again. He put the folded paper on the table between them. I found her belongings 6 months later at a transfer station in Colorado. Inside them was a metal tag. He paused. Same as the one Crow put around your neck. Evelyn looked at the paper on the table. I've been looking for 7 years, Caleb said. For evidence, for witnesses, for someone who could tell me what happened to her. She understood then what she represented to him. Not just a woman from an auction, a thread that might lead back to Rebecca. There was a transfer station, she said carefully, about 3 weeks into the journey. They kept us in a building behind a feed mill. There were other women there. She stopped. Some of them had been there a long time. I heard one of the guards mention a place called Blackstone Camp. Said that's where the ones who caused trouble ended up. Caleb's hands went still on the table. One of the women at the station, she was older than the rest. She kept the younger ones calm at night. I didn't know her name. She looked at him directly. She could have been Rebecca. I don't know. Caleb sat with that for a long moment. She watched him work through it, the hope and the dread of it, both arriving at the same time. Then he picked up the folded paper from the table, the list of questions he'd spent 7 years preparing, and he held it over the fire. You tell me what you're ready to tell me, he said. In your own time. I'm not going to lay that list on you like a debt. He let the paper burn. Evelyn watched it go. She said, I'll write down what I remember. About the station, about Blackstone. I'll put it on paper. She stopped. I can't promise I'll stand in front of the marshal. That's enough, Caleb said. It wasn't enough for justice. They both knew that. But he said it like he meant it anyway. That night, she sat at the small desk in her room and wrote for 2 hours by lamplight. Everything she could remember. The faces, the names she'd overheard, the layout of the transfer station, the guard who'd mentioned Blackstone Camp and described it as being near a rail line in the mountains. When she ran out of things to write, she sat for a while with the pen in her hand. Then she heard it a sound from outside, low and wrong. She went to the window. Orange light was moving at the wrong angle behind the barn. Too bright, too fast, moving up the walls rather than staying steady. The barn was on fire. She ran into the hallway calling Caleb's name. She heard him coming before she finished boots on the floor, the back door already slamming open. She reached the back porch in time to see him running toward the burning building, the heat already pushing outward in waves, the horses screaming inside. She stood on the porch and could not move. Through the smoke and the orange light, and the sound of the fire eating through the old dry wood, she saw a shape near the barn's side door. A man, masked, holding something. He swung it in a short arc. It connected with the back of Caleb's head. Caleb went down. The burning roof gave a deep, structural groan, and then it began to fall. Evelyn screamed his name. It came out before she'd decided to do it, raw and immediate, nothing practiced about it. The sound of it surprised her almost as much as everything else. The roof was going. She could hear it. Not the fast crack of boards breaking, but the slow, grinding heave of something massive, giving up its weight all at once. She ran off the porch and stopped 20 feet from the barn doors because the heat was a wall she couldn't push through. Smoke was pouring out in black rolls. The horses were screaming inside, that particular sound horses make when they're terrified and can't find a way out. Martha was already pulling the rope on the emergency bell, mounted to the corner post, the one Caleb had installed for exactly this kind of situation. The clanging cut through the noise of the fire, and Evelyn could hear answering shouts from the direction of the winter cabins. She couldn't go in. She knew she couldn't. She could feel her skin tightening from the heat at 20 feet. She turned and saw Willow in the small side pasture, separated from the burning barn by 50 yards of fence. The mare was circling, head high, whites of her eyes showing. The gate latch was a simple iron bar. Evelyn ran to it and threw the bar up and swung the gate open. Willow bolted through without stopping, out into the dark field, away from the fire. Safe. It was the most Evelyn could do, and it wasn't enough. And she knew it wasn't enough. Jonah Briggs came at a dead run with 2 ranch hands behind him. He didn't slow down at the heat. He pulled his coat up over his face and went through the barn's side door at an angle, low and fast. Evelyn stood at the edge of the firelight and watched that door. The roof came down in sections. First the east end, where the hay was stored, then the middle. The sound was enormous and terrible. Sparks went up in a column, and the wind took them sideways. Jonah came out through the side door dragging Caleb by the arms, moving backward, heels digging into the dirt. A ranch hand grabbed Caleb's legs, and they pulled him clear and kept moving until they were 40 feet from the building, and the heat wasn't reaching anymore. Caleb was unconscious, burns on his right arm, a wound above his left ear where something had struck him, and his breathing was the shallow, effortful kind that made everyone who heard it go quiet. They carried him to the house. The doctor arrived within the hour, roused from Red Hollow by a ranch hand who rode hard. Evelyn sat in the hallway outside the room while Martha assisted the doctor inside. She sat with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up and listened to what was happening on the other side of the door. Burns treated, shoulder wound cleaned and stitched. The blow had opened a gash that ran 3 inches and was deeper than it looked. Smoke in the lungs. The doctor's voice was even and professional way, which was somehow worse than if he'd sounded worried. An hour passed. Maybe more. Eventually, Martha opened the door and told Evelyn she could come in. She sat in the chair beside the bed. Caleb was pale under the lamplight, his right arm bandaged to the elbow, a cloth wrapped around his head. His breathing had evened out, but it still had a faint rasp at the bottom of each inhale. The fever came on toward midnight. He talked when the fever was high, not in full sentences, fragments, names, broken pieces of things. Rebecca. He said it over and over in different tones. Sometimes it sounded like a question. Sometimes it sounded like an apology. Evelyn sat in the chair and listened and didn't leave. Around 2 in the morning, Martha found her there and pressed a cup of tea into her hands and sat down against the far wall with a blanket over her shoulders. He's been looking for her since she was 19, Martha said quietly. He sold 2 horses to pay a man in Colorado to find her, sent letters to every sheriff's office between here and Kansas City. She paused, never stopped blaming himself for not going after her sooner. Evelyn looked at Caleb's face in the lamplight. Tell me about Blackstone, Martha said, everything you remember. Not for the marshal, not for the court, just so someone else knows. So Evelyn told her. She talked for a long time about the transfer station, the other women, the guards, and their routines. She talked about the woman who'd kept everyone calm, the older one, possibly Rebecca, who'd shared her blanket and remembered everyone's real names when Crow's company tried to replace them with numbers. She told Martha about Hannah. Hannah had been quick and angry and frightened all at once, a combination that made her dangerous in Crow's eyes. She'd watched the guards for 3 weeks before she ran. She'd made it half a mile. Before they'd brought her back, she'd slipped a small ledger inside Evelyn's coat, pressed it against her ribs with both hands in the 3 seconds they had before the guards noticed. She'd been keeping records, Evelyn said. Everything Crow did. Names, payments where women were sent. She must have been building it for months. She stopped. They took my coat when they brought me to the auction barn with the ledger inside it. Martha was very still. But I read it, Evelyn said. I had 3 weeks in that wagon to read it. I remember most of it. She didn't say it like it was brave. It wasn't brave. She'd read it because there was nothing else to do in the dark. And she'd memorized it because Hannah's face was still in her head, and she couldn't make it go away. Caleb's eyes opened around 4 in the morning. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he turned his head and saw Evelyn in the chair beside his bed, the empty teacup on the floor, her coat still on, like she'd sat down in a hurry and forgotten to remove it. You didn't have to stay, he said. His voice came out rough from the smoke. Evelyn looked at him steadily. No one should wake up alone after nearly dying, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he lifted his hands slowly from the blanket, not toward her, just upward, an incomplete gesture, and let it rest on the edge of the bed. She looked at his hand. She reached out and placed her fingers over his, carefully, like setting something fragile down. Her hand was cold. His was warm from the fever. Neither of them moved. Outside, the barn was still smoking. The sun wouldn't be up for another 2 hours. The wind had died down and the ranch was quiet in the particular way. Things go quiet after something terrible has finished happening. Caleb closed his eyes but didn't let go of her hand. Evelyn stayed. They sat like that until morning, and when Martha came in at first light, she looked at the 2 of them and said nothing at all, which was the kindest possible response. By noon, Caleb was sitting up and asking about the horses. By mid-afternoon, Jonah had organized the ranch hands into watches and reported that 2 of Crow's men had been spotted on the Ridge Road. And just before dark, one of the hands came in from the front gate at a run. He'd found a woman collapsed in the snow beside the road, young, badly hurt, wearing the last clothes she'd been given, at a place she called Blackstone Camp. Around her neck hung Crow's metal tag. They carried her inside, and Martha started working. And as the woman's eyes opened and found Evelyn's face across the room, she used the last of her current strength to push 3 words out. "They know where you are," she whispered. Her eyes were desperate and certain. "They are coming tonight." Her name was Anna Doyle. She was 20 years old and had been at Blackstone Camp for 4 months. And she told them everything she knew in a low, steady voice, while Martha cleaned the cuts on her feet and the doctor worked on a wound above her collarbone that had gone raw in the cold. 17 women still at the camp. Crow planned to move them within 3 days, ahead of the federal marshal's arrival. He'd arranged transport by rail from a private siding north of the camp, no station, no witnesses, no record of passengers. Evelyn sat at the foot of Anna's bed and listened and tried to hold all of it still in her mind. Then Anna said, there was a woman there who'd been at the camp longer than anyone else. The guards called her number 4, but she wouldn't answer to it. She kept telling the younger ones her real name, over and over, like she was afraid they'd forget how names worked. Caleb was standing near the door. He hadn't moved in several minutes. Rebecca, he said. Not a question. Anna looked at him. She talked about her brother, said he'd keep looking for her, said it like she was certain. She paused. She tried to help 3 women escape through the north fence about 2 years ago. She created a distraction so they could get out. Anna's voice dropped. The guards caught her after. The room stayed very quiet. She didn't survive it, Anna said. Caleb put one hand on the doorframe and looked at the floor. His shoulders moved once with a slow breath and then went still. Evelyn watched him and waited for the grief to turn outward, the way grief sometimes does when it's been compressed for a long time into anger, into blame, into looking for somewhere to put it. She'd seen it happen. She'd been the nearest available target more than once. He lifted his head and looked at Anna. Thank you for telling me, he said quietly. That was all. Evelyn looked at the floor because something about his face in that moment was too private to witness directly. The federal marshal's message arrived the next morning by way of a rider from Red Hollow. Evelyn read it while Martha held the paper flat on the table. The marshal was offering federal protection at Fort Laramie for any witnesses connected to the Crow case. He strongly recommended that Evelyn travel there immediately given the activity around the ranch. Caleb brought her the message himself that afternoon. He'd spent the morning organizing the ranch hands into defensive positions and moving the remaining horses to the far pasture. His shoulder was still bandaged, and he was holding himself slightly sideways to favor it. But he was moving, and that was what mattered. He put the message on the table in front of her. Fort Laramie, he said. The marshal has deputies there. You'd be safe, she read it again. You want me to go. I want you protected. Those aren't the same thing. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Crow has men watching the ridge. He knows you're here, and he knows what you remember. Staying puts you and everyone on this ranch in his crosshairs. And if I go to Fort Laramie, he loses his main reason to keep pressure on this property. He looked at her directly. I'm going to be honest with you, Evelyn. I can defend this ranch for a while. I can't defend it forever. Not with a burned barn and half my horses gone and men on that ridge who are willing to burn people alive to retrieve a witness. She looked at her hands on the table. He'd prepared a wagon. She could see it through the kitchen window, hitched and loaded, a canvas cover tied down against the weather. Martha had put together a bundle of clothes and food. He'd withdrawn money from the ranch account and put it in a pouch that sat beside the message on the table. All of it arranged before he'd even come to talk to her. She understood, on one level, what that meant. He'd done the hard preparation work before having the conversation because he didn't want her to feel like the decision was being made in a rush. He was giving her time to sit with a choice that was already possible rather than just theoretical. But there was another part of her, quieter and less reasonable, that looked at the packed wagon and the money on the table and heard something different. He was ready for her to leave. She stood up from the table and went to her room and got the few things Martha had given her over the past weeks: the gray wool dress, a pair of boots that actually fit, a hairbrush. She wrapped them in the cloth Martha used for bundling laundry and brought the bundle back to the main room. She set the room key on the table beside the money. Caleb looked at it. The room will still be yours, he said. Whether you come back or not, I'm not reassigning it. He picked up the key and put it back in her hand. She looked at it sitting in her palm, small and iron and slightly warm from his hand. She put it in her coat pocket. She was still standing there when Jonah came through the back door, moving fast, and the look on his face said the decision had been made for them. "They're on the road," Jonah said. 8 riders, maybe 10, coming from the south. The room shifted into a different speed. Caleb was on his feet before Jonah finished. He sent the ranch hands to their positions. He told Martha to take Anna and move to the root cellar below the house. He found Evelyn standing in the middle of the main room, holding her bundle and the key, and looking at the kitchen window like she was trying to calculate something. "We're going out the back," he said. "Old mountain trail. It's slower, but they won't expect it." She nodded. They were almost to the back door when the sound came, hoofbeats, too many of them, coming around the east side of the property. Then a voice she recognized, amplified somehow, carrying across the snow-covered yard. "Silas Crow, Caleb, Mercer." His voice was pleasant and unhurried, the voice of a man who had done this before and found it straightforward. "I'll make this simple. Send the girl out before sunrise, and I'll leave your property, your horses, and your workers in the condition I found them. Keep her, and I won't." Evelyn stood absolutely still. Caleb's hand was near the back door handle. He looked at her. "We go now," he said quietly. Through the back, she looked toward the front of the house, where Crow's voice had come from. She thought about Anna's face when she described the guards catching Rebecca at the north fence. She thought about 17 women still at Blackstone Camp, being loaded onto a rail car in 3 days. She thought about Jonah and Martha and the ranch hands who had done nothing wrong except work for a man that Crow wanted to punish. She went to her room and came back to the main room with a piece of paper and wrote on it for less than a minute. Her handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear enough. She folded it once. Caleb was watching her. She put the folded paper in her pocket and said, "Tell me the trail route," he told her. She listened carefully and repeated it back to him. Then they went out through the back. They made it to the edge of the tree line before the first shots were fired. Warning shots, aimed high, meant to stop rather than hit. Crow had men on the east ridge, too. Caleb pulled her down into the snow behind a deadfall, and they lay there while the shots settled and the riders repositioned. "We can still get through," he said. She didn't answer. He looked at her face. She was memorizing the trail route. He could see at her lips, moving slightly, fixing the turns in the right order. "Evelyn," he said. "I know the way," she said. "You told me clearly." He heard something in that he didn't like. "What are you thinking?" She met his eyes. "That there are people who will get hurt tonight because of me. I know it's not my fault," she said. And there was something hard-won and deliberate in those words, like she'd been practicing them. "I know who is responsible. But knowing that doesn't stop people from getting hurt." He put his hand over hers in the snow. "We go together." She nodded. But that night, when the ranch had gone quiet, and Caleb was keeping watch from the front room, and the house was as still as it ever got, Evelyn sat up in her room and took the folded paper out of her pocket. She read what she'd written. "He will stop if I go back. Please do not follow me." She looked at it for a long time. Then she put on her coat and her boots and picked up nothing else. And she opened the window that faced away from the front of the house and climbed out into the dark and walked toward Crow's last known position, in the snow. The cold was different at night. During the day, it had weight to it, something you pushed against. At night, it just entered, moved through your coat and your dress, and your skin, like it, was looking for something to take. Evelyn walked with her arms crossed against her chest and her eyes on the line of trees to her left, which blocked the wind from the ridge. She made it maybe a quarter mile before they found her. 2 men, on foot, moving quietly through the snow from opposite directions. They'd been watching for exactly this, someone coming out alone. She understood, the moment she saw them, that they'd expected her. Crow knew how frightened women thought. They didn't speak to her. One took her arm, and the other moved ahead to clear the path, and they walked her through the trees to the stage road, where a wagon was waiting. Crow was sitting on the seat. He looked at her in the lantern light with the expression of someone whose calculations had been confirmed. "I was wondering how long you'd take," he said. She stood in the snow and said nothing. He climbed down and stood in front of her and spoke in that careful, reasonable voice he always used when he wanted something. "We're going to resolve this tonight, quietly. You'll sign a statement for the territorial court explaining that Caleb Mercer abducted you from my company's lawful custody and held you against your will. You'll describe the conditions of your captivity. You'll state that you entered no agreement with him and received no payment." She looked at the frozen ruts in the road. "In return," he said, "I will remove my men from his property. His barn is already gone. That can be enough damage. Or it can be the beginning of a much longer conversation. That's his choice. And yours." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper and a pen. One of his men held a lantern up. She looked at the paper. She thought about Caleb sleeping on the hallway floor outside her locked door. She thought about the apple pieces on the fence rail. She thought about him sitting across the table from her, burning a list of 7 years' worth of questions because she wasn't ready to answer them. She reached for the pen. Her fingers touched it. She thought about him standing on the auction platform and saying, "I did not buy the woman. I bought the last claim you will ever place on her." She thought about his voice through a locked door at 4 in the morning. "You're at Mercer Ranch. The door is still locked." "I'm not coming in," she thought about what he'd said to her about Willow. "Fear is not disobedience." She lowered her hand. She looked at Crow's face. "No," she said. It came out barely above a whisper. Her voice shook on the single syllable. It was not a declaration, not a confrontation. She had nothing in her that felt like courage in that moment. She had only the memory of a man who had never once required her to be more than she was, and she found she could not use his name to destroy him. Crow's face went through something fast and controlled. He picked up the pen she hadn't taken and placed it precisely back inside his coat. He hit the table beside her. Not her. The table hard enough that the lantern swung on its hook. "You think he's coming for you," he said. "You think this ends with him riding up on a white horse and—" "I don't think anything," she said. Still quiet, still shaking. "My answer is no." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he told one of his men to put her in the wagon. They locked her inside. Same type as before, wooden box, canvas roof, iron latch on the outside. The same smell almost. Cold wood and old canvas, and the faint chemical residue of whatever they'd used to keep the first group of women quiet during transport. She pressed her back into the corner and pulled her knees up and breathed. She told herself all the things she'd been slowly learning to tell herself. She was still alive. She had said no, and she was still alive. The wagon was moving, but she was in one piece. But the dark was complete inside the canvas, and the cold was getting worse, and somewhere behind her, on that mountain road, Caleb was going to find her note. Back at the ranch, he found it in under 10 minutes. Jonah heard him read it and watched his face do something that went through several different things very quickly and arrived at a kind of focused stillness that was worse than anger. "How long ago?" Caleb said. "Can't be more than 30 minutes. She went out the east window. Caleb was already moving toward the stable. "Your shoulder," Jonah said. "I'm aware of my shoulder, Caleb." Jonah followed him. "You're walking into what he wants. He's hoping you come after her alone so he can deal with you somewhere private." "Yes," Caleb said. He kept moving. Jonah grabbed his arm, gently but firmly. "Then take me, and take the deputy the marshal sent. We do this right." Caleb stopped. He stood in the cold yard between the house and the burned-out shell of the barn, and Jonah watched him work through the variables. "She went because she still believes her life is worth less than everyone else's," Caleb said. "She walked into that man's hands to keep us safe. I know. She's been telling herself that lie since she was a child in an orphanage, and they tied food and shelter to her behavior." He looked at the tree line, where her tracks disappeared into the dark. "I'm going after her. We go after her. Jonah said. Together. Jonah, you, and the deputy. We do this right so we can actually get her back. Caleb turned. He looked at Jonah for a long moment. My shoulder's fine, he said. Let's go. Meanwhile, Crow's wagon moved north through the mountain dark toward Blackstone Camp, with Evelyn locked inside and the pen still uncapped in his coat pocket and the unsigned paper folded against his chest. He wasn't worried. He'd been doing this long enough to know that one no was not the end of the conversation. He'd ask again at Blackstone, where she'd be less comfortable, where she'd have had time to think about how far she was from anyone who might come for her. He was wrong about that last part, but he didn't know it yet. In the locked wagon, Evelyn closed her eyes and held on to the only clear thought she had. She had said no. Whatever came next, that was real. She had said no, and the word still belonged to her, and Crow hadn't been able to take it back. Outside, through the canvas, she could hear the wind picking up across the mountain road. It was going to snow before morning. She pressed her back harder into the corner and held on to that one word, like a lamp in a dark room, and she waited. Blackstone Camp looked different in winter. Evelyn had heard it described by other women. At the transfer station, a mining settlement converted into a holding facility, remote enough that no one passing on a road would hear anything unusual. In the dark, with snow coming sideways off the mountain, it looked like a place that had decided to disappear. They brought her in through the main gate just before dawn. Crow had arranged something he called a hearing. A table in the camp's main building, lanterns on both ends, 6 of his men standing along the walls. 2 of the camp workers were seated, as though they were witnesses to something official. He'd even produced a ledger and a pen and a territorial court seal he'd almost certainly acquired through the same methods he acquired everything else. Caleb was already there. He was standing near the back wall with his wrists bound in front of him and blood on the side of his face from a cut above his ear. He looked at Evelyn when they brought her in, and she saw something move through his expression: relief first, then a fast, controlled anger, then nothing. He put the nothing on like a coat. She understood immediately. He'd come in deliberately. Let them take him, so Jonah and the deputy could move freely around the perimeter. Crow sat at the table and gestured for Evelyn to be brought forward. She stood in front of him with 2 of his men at her shoulders. Last opportunity, Crow said pleasantly. You sign the statement. You tell these men what you've told me, that Caleb Mercer took you without your consent and held you at his ranch, that you had no agreement with him and no desire to remain. He pushed the paper toward her. He goes free. You fulfill the remainder of your contract with my company. Everyone goes home. He was lying about all of it. She knew that. Caleb would not go free. She would not go anywhere she chose. But she looked at Caleb across the room and thought about what it would cost her to sign and what it would cost him, and her hands were already shaking before she'd made any decision at all. Caleb met her eyes. Don't, he said clearly. His voice was steady despite the cut on his face and the bound wrists and the 6 men in the room. Whatever happens to me, you are still free. Crow turned and looked at him with the mild irritation of someone whose meeting was being interrupted. Evelyn's throat closed. She stood there and could not speak and could not sign and could not move, which Crow interpreted as paralysis working in his favor. He nodded to one of his men. Take her to the women's quarters, he said. Let her think until morning. The women's quarters was a long room with a barred window and 12 women inside it. Most of them looked at Evelyn when she came in with the cautious attention of people who had learned to assess new arrivals quickly. One older woman near the back wall looked at her for a long moment and then said in a low voice, You're the one Crow's been chasing. Yes, Evelyn said. You came from a ranch, a man named Mercer. Yes. The woman nodded slowly. Crow says he's going to hang your cowboy at sunrise. The room was very quiet. Evelyn sat down on the floor with her back against the wall and pressed her hands flat against the cold wood and breathed. A woman named Dora sat beside her without asking permission. She was thin and calm, with the specific calm of someone who had been frightened for so long that the fear had become background noise. "There's something you should know," Dora said quietly. "Anna, the girl who escaped 2 nights ago, she told us if anyone came, to look at the chapel's east wall, inside the false panel behind the second pew." "Hannah's ledger," Evelyn said. Dora looked at her. "You knew about it." "Hannah gave it to me before they took her. I read it in the wagon." She looked at the barred window. "But the physical ledger is better than my memory. A court needs the original." Dora stood up and moved to the far wall where 2 other women were sitting. They spoke in whispers for less than a minute. Then one of them, young, maybe 17, with rope-scared wrists that matched Evelyn's own, stood up and went to the corner of the room where a loose board had been worked free from the floor. She reached in and pulled out a small, dark book. She crossed the room and held it out to Evelyn. "We found it last week," Dora said. "Crow ordered. The chapel cleared yesterday. We took it before his men got inside." Evelyn looked at Hannah's ledger in the young woman's hands. She took it. She wasn't calm about it. Her hands shook badly enough that she had to grip the cover with both palms. She was terrified, and she was sitting in a locked room in a camp in the mountains, while Crow planned to execute the man who had spent $100 to give her the right to lock her own door. But she lifted her dress and pressed the ledger flat against her side and tucked her belt over it to hold it there. Outside, she heard horses, not riders, arriving, but horses moving fast in a loose group, hooves scattering without direction. Someone had released the camp's horses from the main stable. The shouting started immediately. Then, farther away, the crack of a telegraph wire being tested. Jonah was moving. The deputy was moving. Smoke started entering the room under the door. Not from the women's quarters, from the chapel at the far end of the building. Crow had ordered the records burned, and the fire had caught faster than expected. One of the women started coughing. Evelyn went to the door and started pounding on it. Down the hall, something heavy hit the floor. Then the bar on the outside of their door lifted, and Caleb pulled it open from the other side, one wrist still wrapped in rope, a guard's lantern in his free hand. He looked at Evelyn. His eyes went to the line of her belt, where the ledger pressed against her dress, and back up to her face. "Can you walk?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Then stay close." He led them down the hallway toward the main exit. The smoke was thickening from the chapel end. Women moved behind Evelyn, quiet and fast. Jonah appeared at the main door with the deputy behind him and began directing people through into the cold yard where the horses had scattered. They made it almost to the gate. Crow stepped out from the side of the building with 2 men and grabbed Evelyn's arm. He pulled her backward, and the ledger pressed hard against her ribs, and she gripped it with her elbow from the outside of her dress because she would not let it go. Caleb turned. Crow put himself behind Evelyn with one arm across her shoulders and looked at Caleb over her head. "Put it down," he said. Caleb's gun was raised. His eyes moved to Evelyn's face, checking her, then back to Crow. He lowered the weapon. In the distance, hoofbeats, coming fast from the south road. Crow heard them too. His grip on her tightened. A rifle fired somewhere above them, on the ridge. Caleb dropped from sight. Evelyn's breath stopped. Then she heard Jonah shout from the gate, and she understood the shot had cut the rope they'd tied around Caleb's chest when they'd dragged him back to the post. Caleb was on the ground, but he was moving. The federal marshal crested the ridge road with 6 deputies behind him, and Blackstone camps last night began to end. Caleb hit the ground and rolled, and came up moving. The post behind him was still standing. The cut rope hung off it in 2 pieces. He crossed the yard at a low run, putting distance between himself and Crow's remaining men before they recalculated, and found a split-rail fence to come around the far side of. Jonah had the main gate open. The rescued women were moving through it in a group. Dora at the front, keeping them together, the deputy guiding them toward the marshal's men on the road. Crow still had Evelyn. Caleb saw the wagon moving. Crow had gotten her into it, while his 2 men held the yard, and the horses were already pulling north toward the mountain pass. Fast, but not uncontrolled. A man with a plan. Caleb looked around the yard. Willow was standing at the far fence, separated from the panicked camp horses, because she'd gone still the moment the noise started. That was what she did. She went still and watched and waited until someone she trusted arrived. Caleb crossed to her, speaking before he reached her, letting his voice get there first. She turned toward the sound. He put his hand on her neck, and she didn't move away. He mounted and went after the wagon. The pass road was narrow with snow packed hard on both sides and the drop on the left growing steeper as it climbed. Crow's driver was good keeping the horses on the center line, moving at a speed that was fast for conditions. Caleb pushed Willow into a canter and felt her find her footing on the packed snow with the careful precision of an animal that had survived bad handling by becoming very deliberate about where she put her feet. He was closing the distance when Crow appeared through the wagon's rear canvas with a pistol. The shot hit Caleb in the left side. He kept riding. The pain was real and present, and he noted it the way you note. Whether it was there, it was significant. He would deal with it later. He pulled up alongside the wagon and reached for the driver's seat, and Crow's driver threw an elbow at his head. Caleb took it on the cheekbone and grabbed the seat rail anyway and pulled himself across. He and the driver went sideways off the seat together. The horses kept going for another 50 feet, slowing without a hand on the reins, and stopped 20 yards from where the road's left edge became a straight drop into the ravine. Caleb was on his feet first. The driver stayed down. Crow came around the front of the wagon, with Evelyn gripped against him and the pistol leveled. "You're shot," Crow observed. "Yes," Caleb said. "Then be sensible." Caleb looked at Evelyn. She was pale, and her jaw was set, and she had one hand pressed flat against her ribs from the outside, holding something in place. Her eyes were clear, frightened, but clear. He lowered his weapon. Hoofbeats behind him. The marshal and 2 deputies came around the bend in the road and pulled up their horses. Crow assessed the situation with the speed of long practice. He straightened up and moved Evelyn slightly to his right, positioning himself behind her shoulder, and addressed the marshal in the reasonable, professional voice. "Marshal, I'm glad you're here. This man has been harboring a contracted employee of my company and has just assaulted my driver. The woman you see is Evelyn Moore, under a valid territorial contract, and I'm in the process of returning her to." "He sold us," Evelyn said. Everyone looked at her. Her voice had shaken on the first word. It shook on all the other ones, too. She wasn't steady, and she wasn't composed, and she stepped forward out of Crow's grip because he was surprised enough by the sound of her voice to loosen his hold for 1 second. She put herself beside Caleb and pointed at Crow. "He sold us," she said again. "He killed Hannah. The ledger is beneath my dress." She reached under her belt and pulled out the small dark book and held it out to the marshal. Crow moved. Caleb moved faster. He stepped between Evelyn and Crow. And the shot that Crow fired from the concealed pistol hit Caleb in the shoulder, the same shoulder, the wounded one, and he went down to one knee in the snow. The marshal's pistol came out. The shot took Crow in the leg and put him down in the road, and 2 deputies were on him before he finished falling. Evelyn dropped beside Caleb in the snow. He was on one knee with his hand pressed to his shoulder and his face gone white, but his eyes were open and he was looking at her. "Are you safe?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Caleb, are you hurt?" "No." "Stop talking about me." He almost smiled. Then his eyes went to the ledger in her hand and back to her face, and she watched something in him release, not dramatically, just quietly, like a rope going slack. "Good," he said. Then he sat down fully in the snow and let the marshal's deputy take a look at the shoulder, and Evelyn stayed beside him with her hand on his arm and did not let go. The marshal compared the ledger against Crow's contracts, line by line, right there on the mountain road. Anna and the other rescued women confirmed the names, the payment records, the identification tags. The corrupt Red Hollow sheriff attempted to ride out through the far end of camp when the marshal's deputies arrived, and made it approximately 400 yards before two riders brought him back. Crow was loaded into a wagon, under armed guard, with a bandaged leg and no coat, which Evelyn noted without sympathy. It was fully light by the time they started back down the mountain, cold and clear, the kind of winter morning that makes everything look sharp and exact and true. Caleb rode down in the marshal's wagon because the deputy refused to let him back on a horse. Evelyn sat across from him with the recovered ledger in her lap, and Willow trailing on a lead rope behind them. He slept most of the way down. She watched the road and held the ledger and let him sleep. Caleb woke in the Red Hollow clinic on the third day. The bullet had passed through cleanly, but the blood loss had been severe enough that the doctor had spent the better part of 2 days being non-committal when Martha asked direct questions. The shoulder would heal. Everything else was a matter of time and rest, neither of which Caleb was naturally inclined toward. Evelyn was sitting in the chair beside his bed. She had her hand resting near his on the blanket, close but not touching, and when he opened his eyes, she pulled it back immediately and sat up straight. "I'm sorry," she said, automatic, reflexive, the old habit. Caleb looked at her for a moment. "Put it back," he said. His voice was rough from days of shallow breathing, but the words were clear. She looked at his hand on the blanket. Then she reached out and placed her fingers over his. They stayed that way while the morning light moved across the clinic wall. He recovered slowly and didn't pretend otherwise. Evelyn visited every day with Martha. She slept at the boarding house in a separate room with a lock she used every night, and Caleb never once suggested she should do otherwise. When nightmares woke her, she knocked on Martha's door instead of sitting alone in the dark, which was new and harder than it sounded, and she did it anyway. The legal proceedings moved with the methodical certainty of a machine that had finally been given the right material to work with. Hannah's ledger, the identification tags, the false contracts, the rescued women's testimony, the payment records connecting the Red Hollow sheriff to Crow's company. The marshal described it to the territorial court as the most complete evidentiary case he'd presented in 20 years of service. Silas Crow was convicted on all counts: kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, trafficking, fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of Hannah. Life imprisonment. The judge used the word permanent twice, which the marshal said was unusual. The sheriff received 25 years. 4 company agents received sentences between 10 and 20 years. 2 guards who cooperated with investigators received reductions in exchange for the locations of 3 additional holding camps, which federal deputies raided within 8 months. The Western Brides Employment Company was dissolved, its assets seized, its records turned over to the court. The women rescued from Blackstone were offered a genuine choice, which was something most of them hadn't been offered in a long time. Anna stayed at Mercer Ranch and helped Martha. 3 women returned east to family. 2 opened a laundry in Red Hollow. 1 went to work at the clinic. Several waited for Rebecca House to open. Lucy Warren, one of the youngest, was reunited with an older sister who had spent 2 years believing her dead. The reunion happened in the clinic waiting room, and nobody who witnessed it mentioned it afterward, out of a shared instinct toward privacy. Hannah was buried under her real name. Rebecca's remains were returned to Mercer Ranch and placed beneath the cottonwood tree near the eastern fence, where Caleb said she and he had climbed as children. Her grave marker read, "She opened the way for others." He chose those words himself and didn't explain them to anyone, and no one asked him to. 3 months after the rescue, Caleb brought Evelyn to a small cottage near Red Hollow. It was modest and solid, with a bedroom that had an interior lock, a kitchen with a south-facing window, a small garden under snow that would open up in spring, and a stable just large enough for Willow. Martha had furnished it. There was firewood stacked to the eaves. Caleb gave her the property deed. Her name on it, hers alone, registered with the territorial court. He gave her a bank book containing her share of the court compensation. the original $100 he'd paid at the auction, and wages calculated for the work she'd done at the ranch. She looked at the deed and then at him. "You're sending me away," she said. "I'm making sure you have somewhere else to go," he said. "Before I ask what I want, you must have somewhere else you can go." She understood the difference. She sat with it anyway, because it was large. He told her he loved her. He sat across from her at the cottage table and said it plainly. Without decoration, he told her it wasn't because she reminded him of Rebecca, or because she'd helped expose Crow, or because he felt responsible for her. He loved the quiet determination it took her to get up each morning. He loved her patience with Willow. He loved the care she extended to other people, despite having received so little of it herself. He loved the trust she gave slowly, which meant it was real when it arrived. He didn't ask for an answer. He left her alone in the cottage with the deed and the bank book and Willow in the stable, and he drove back to the ranch in the early dark. Evelyn locked the door from the inside. She cooked a small meal and ate it at her own table, in her own chair, in her own house. She put the property deed under her pillow before she slept. She had a nightmare around midnight, the auction platform, the laughter, the rope on her wrists, and she woke in the dark of a room where no one was coming through the door. She lit the lamp herself. She sat at the table until the fear passed, which took a while, and then she went back to sleep. By morning, she understood something she hadn't been able to see before. There was a difference between needing Caleb and choosing him. She could survive without him. She had a deed that proved it, and a bank book that proved it, and a door she'd locked herself that proved it. She simply didn't want a life where she never went back to him. At sunrise, she saddled Willow and rode to Mercer Ranch. Caleb was at the front gate, rehanging the post Crow's men had damaged when he heard hoofbeats on the road. He turned and watched her ride up and stopped what he was doing and waited. "Something wrong with the cottage," he said. "No," Evelyn said. "It's safe and warm, and it's mine." She looked at him from Willow's back. "That's why I can answer you now." She told him she wouldn't stay because he'd paid for her, or protected her, or taken a bullet meant for her, or given her property. She'd stay because he was the first person who had ever given her freedom without punishing her for using it. "I love you," she said. "That's my answer." He reached into his coat and produced the original auction receipt, worn soft from being folded and unfolded. Across it, in his handwriting, paid in full not for a bride, but for her freedom. She read it, then she took it and tore it into 4 pieces and put them in the fire, burning in the gatepost iron basket. "They believed $100 was too much for a woman like me," she said. Caleb looked at her. "There has never been enough money in this territory to measure what you are worth." She asked him, directly, whether he truly accepted that she might never give him children. "I did not save you in order to receive a different future from your body," he said. "I need you to know you were never broken." He proposed, with the cottage deed still in her name, and the bank book still separate, and a clear statement that she could use the cottage whenever she needed it, hold equal authority at Rebecca House, and cancel or postpone anything at any time. He owed her no answer from gratitude. She said yes. They married 6 months after Blackstone, beneath the cottonwood tree beside Rebecca's grave, on a clear morning in early summer. Small ceremony. Martha and Jonah, Anna and the federal marshal, the town doctor, ranch hands, women from Rebecca House, neighbors from Red Hollow, who had eventually told the truth about which side they should have been on. Evelyn wore a cream dress she chose herself. When the question was asked, she answered in a clear voice, "I choose him freely." Caleb promised never to use protection as ownership, never to demand silence, never to enter a locked room without permission, never to make her prove love through suffering, and to stay beside her for as long as she kept choosing him. The cottage stayed in her name. 1 year after the auction, Rebecca House held 8 private bedrooms, a medical room, a kitchen, a sewing room, a schoolroom, a stable, a travel fund, and a network of reliable drivers and federal deputies who knew the roads. 27 women had passed through its doors. Some stayed one night, some stayed months. Not one was charged for food or shelter. Evelyn met every new arrival herself. She wasn't fearless. She still flinched at raised voices. She still had nights, when the nightmares came, and she locked the bedroom door, and Caleb slept on his side of it without complaint. And in the morning, they had breakfast together and didn't make the night before into more than it was. But she knew which doors locked from inside. She knew where the food was kept. She knew how to tell a frightened woman that accepting help creates no debt. That knowledge was hers, built from the worst years of her life, and she used it every day. At sunset, a wagon came up the road to Rebecca's house. Inside sat a young woman in a torn coat with her eyes down and her shoulders drawn in. She flinched when Caleb approached the horses, and he saw it immediately and stepped back. Evelyn came off the porch. For one moment, the auction barn came back to her, the laughter, the platform, the rope, the man asking whether $100 was too much for a barren bride. Caleb held out his hand. She took it. Then she walked to the wagon and opened the gate herself. "No one here owns you," she told the woman. "You don't have to earn your supper, and you may lock your door from the inside. You are safe now." The woman began to cry. Evelyn helped her down. Caleb lit the lamp above the porch, and the small square of light it threw across the snow reached all the way to the open gate, where a piece of red cloth moved in the evening wind. Rebecca's cloth, still there. The gate stayed open. The lamps stayed burning. And Evelyn Moore, who had stood on a platform and been priced at $100 and told she was worth less than that, stood beside the husband she had freely chosen, before a refuge that would outlive them both, and was finally, completely, irrevocably home. Evelyn Moore began this story on a wooden platform, with her wrists tied, and a crowd laughing at her price. She ended it standing on a porch she owned, beside a man she chose, opening a gate for another frightened woman who had just arrived with nothing. That distance from the platform to the porch is what this story is really about. Not the rescue, the journey between those two places. The first thing this story teaches us is that safety is not the same as freedom. Caleb gave Evelyn a roof, a locked door, and food without conditions. That was safety. But real freedom only arrived the night she slept alone in her own cottage, with her name on the deed, and no one waiting for her to be grateful. Most of us have spent time confusing those two things, accepting shelter and calling it choice. Evelyn had to learn the difference, slowly, painfully, and on her own terms. So do most people. The second thing this story teaches us is that healing does not follow a straight line, and it does not arrive on schedule. Evelyn did not wake up one morning. Cured a year after the auction, she still flinched at raised voices. She still locked the bedroom door on bad nights. She still kept food close when she felt unsafe. And none of that made her broken. None of that made her unworthy of love or a future. The story never asks her to perform recovery for anyone's comfort. It simply lets her heal at the speed that healing actually moves, which is slower than we want and more uneven than stories usually admit. That honesty matters. The third thing this story teaches us is about the difference between protection and ownership. Caleb protected Evelyn from the first night to the last chapter, and he never once used that protection as a leash. He never said, "I saved you, therefore you owe me." He never made safety conditional on obedience, gratitude, or affection. He understood, and this is the thing worth carrying out of this story, that protecting someone and owning someone are not variations of the same thing. They are opposites. Real protection gives people the ability to leave. That is how you know it is real. The fourth thing, and perhaps the most quiet one, is what Evelyn's small acts of resistance actually mean. She did not defeat Crow through strength or strategy or a dramatic speech. She dropped a pen. She whispered one word in the dark of a freight wagon surrounded by his men. She pressed a ledger against her ribs and held on. Those were not heroic moments in the conventional sense. They were terrified moments where she chose, by the thinnest margin, not to disappear completely. And they were enough. This story argues that enough is enough. You do not have to be brave in the way the world expects. You only have to keep the one thing that still belongs to you, your own name for yourself, your own understanding of what happened, your own quiet no, and that is sufficient to change everything. And finally, Rebecca House, the refuge built in a dead woman's name, funded by a criminal's seized assets, managed by a housekeeper, a foreman, a rescued woman, and a cowboy who learned that justice is not the same as revenge. Rebecca did not survive to see it. Hannah did not survive to see it. But their choices protecting the younger women, keeping records in secret, leaving pieces of red cloth along safe routes, those choices outlived them and became the foundation of something that would help women they never met. That is what legacy actually looks like. Not monuments, not speeches, small, deliberate acts of care that continue doing their work long after the person who began them is gone. Take that with you, the locked door that belongs to you, the freedom that does not require permission, the love that does not arrive with a price attached, and the understanding that your fear does not make you unworthy, it makes you human, which is more than enough. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and organizations depicted are entirely imaginary and bear no resemblance to real persons or actual historical circumstances.